Okay, great. Well, thanks for having me. I'm a little nervous because you guys are all such incredible experts in invasive species, and I'm gonna just blunder in here like this amateur and tell you, about a different way of thinking about it. But I'm sure you guys have thought about some of these issues, so it'll be fun. My book came out in 2011, around the time in the fall. And the book was kind of grew out of work that I'd done as a staff writer for the journal Nature, where I was writing about ecology and conservation biology a lot, and seeing a lot of sort of common threads in different subfields like paleoecology and restoration ecology and so on, sort of challenging this idea that it was either like sensical or feasible to go back in time to these historical baselines. So the book has sort of two parts. The first part, and it's written for the general public. The first part sort of explains why these historical baselines are slipperier than we think, and maybe don't make as much sense as we used to think, especially the ones that are just pegged to when Europeans showed up somewhere. And then the second half of the book talks about all the cool new strategies we can use when we're not so enthralled to historical baselines, things like assisted migration or rewilding with proxies, and sort of more out there and proactive approaches that I thought people would get interested in. But I think probably the most controversial chapter in the whole thing was my chapter about reassessing invasive species. I talk a lot in there about Mark Davis and Dov Sachs and some of these ecologists who are sort of rethinking, how bad are these invasives and why do we hate them so much? And so, when we think about non-natives in general, not just invasives, but all non-natives, we think, why do we cringe when we see them out in the woods or out in the fields? And when I talk to people who are in the field, they often start by saying that they don't belong there, that they shouldn't be there. And the sense of not belonging, it's because people brought them. And then there's the sort of more outcome-oriented reasons why people don't like them. They displace or outcompete natives, or they directly kill natives. I threw the brown tree snake here on this slide. If there's ever a species that everyone could agree just really doesn't belong there, it would be the brown tree snake. I think he's got 12 forest birds already that he's been responsible for driving to extinction, something like that. Perhaps they've reduced water quality. But there's also this emotional component that they are ugly because they don't belong there because people brought them. And so why don't they belong there? Why is people bringing them there a problem? The story that I like to talk about to kind of test our intuitions on this is the whole ruddy duck case. I'm sure many of you know this story. So we've got the ruddy duck in North America, and somehow it starts showing up over in Europe, where there's a related fowl called the white-headed duck. And the ruddy duck has a different mating strategy than the white-headed duck, and it's actually a much more aggressive mating strategy. So all of a sudden, all these hybrid individuals start showing up, especially in Spain, sort of half white-headed, half ruddies. And European bird preservationists are very concerned about the threat to the white-headed duck, and especially in Britain, where they're bird crazy. They start throwing millions of pounds at trying to stop the flow of ruddy ducks and trying to stop these hybridization events. But then there was this moment that I thought was really interesting, where all of a sudden people started worrying that maybe the ruddy duck got over there by itself. Like maybe it rafted over, or maybe it flew over. In which case, crap, we shouldn't be spending all this money trying to stop them from hybridizing, because then it would be natural. So there were some papers that took some different approaches, including genetic approaches, to try to figure out whether the movement of these ruddies was anthropogenic or not. And they sort of were able to come to the conclusion that they felt pretty confident that these ruddies were getting there because humans were moving them. So then they were like, okay, let's go back to our program of spending millions and millions of pounds trying to stop this. And to somebody who's not in the field, this seems kind of almost comical. Like, what does it matter how this duck got over there, whether it came over on a tree branch or on or whether it was introduced by some landowner, because this implies that somehow there's this magical quality that humans have that if they are the causative agent, it is crap, whereas if they're not the causative agent, it is natural and to be celebrated. Also, you know, the ruddy duck wasn't eating the white-headed duck; it was hybridizing with it. So if you take a gene-centric view of sort of conservation, many of the genes of the white-headed duck are persisting into these hybrid offspring. Its lineage is continuing; it's just no longer separate. So it depends on what level of biological organization you care about conserving. Maybe if you're gene-focused, this isn't such a bad thing. So obviously, you know, we like things that are natural. I like things that are natural. I'm as big a sucker as anybody else in the drugstore for like the shampoos that say all natural on them. But this is, you know, this is the appeal to nature, and we all know that ultimately not everything that's natural is better. You know, the idea that humans are unnatural and the idea that natural is better is what's underlying a lot of these emotional responses, and I don't think either of them are true. You know, if you get bitten by a snake, that's a natural thing, but it's not very good for you. And sometimes we really celebrate unnatural actions, you know, when we're trying to deal with the chestnut problem and we are breeding chestnuts or even genetically modifying chestnuts to try to create a line of chestnuts that can repopulate our eastern forests. We're totally happy to have humans involved in this story as long as, you know, we get these chestnuts back. So the idea that humans aren't natural and the idea that natural is always better doesn't seem to hold up. Also, if all changes caused by humans are bad, then we're living in like a universe of bad, because our entire North American scene is completely anthropogenic. If we had never been here, we'd have perhaps be seeing something much more like this, because many of the extinctions of megafauna of 13,000 years ago during the Pleistocene were probably at least partially caused by human hunting. So, you know, we can't get the mastodons back, we can't get the giant ground sloths back. You know, does that mean that we should just throw up our hands and go home and say that we failed and now we live in a world of crap? I don't think any of us want to do that. So, you know, and then there's the idea that somehow, okay, well maybe those extinctions can't be undone, but we can still go back to this perfect time where all the plants and animals are in the right place. But of course, people who lived here before Europeans also moved plants around and animals around, and the exact perfect natural range of any particular species, especially if it's a species that might have been used by humans, could be pretty difficult to pin down. Then, you know, we have questions about what the baseline should be, and then we have questions about whether it's feasible or not to return to that baseline. So as the climate changes, as land use changes, kind of roll over the world, the question is it even possible to put everything back? One of my favorite places to think about all these issues is Hawaii, because it's like a little tiny miniature version of the Earth, but maybe a couple of generations into the future as far as movements of plants and animals. A lot of extinctions, a lot of tragedy, but also lots of interesting conundrums, like the so-called canoe plants that were brought by Polynesians, so maybe 1,700 years ago. So here's the kukui nut, which is one of these canoe plants, and also the state tree of Hawaii. You know, do we want to put this back? Do we want to remove it back to its native range? Well, first of all, we don't know its native range. It was moved around so early and so thoroughly by seafaring people in the Pacific that we don't know where it actually originally came from. But we know it probably wasn't native to Hawaii. But I think that there would be a riot if you tried to remove it from Hawaii. So, you know, I don't think I'm telling you guys anything terribly new. We all know that there are cultural aspects to these non-natives. But I think that I guess what I advocate is a kind of a switching of the burden of proof. Instead of starting out with the presumption that a non-native is guilty until proven innocent, like okay, you're non-native, but you've got this great cultural significance, or you're non-native, but we happen to have an endangered native depending on you for food or nesting in you, so we'll give you a pass. Or you're non-native, but you pollinate our crops, so we'll keep you around. I think we should switch it at this point. I think that we stirred the pot so thoroughly that we should start saying, okay, you're a species. What's our goal for this site? And do you, as a species, make that goal, advance that goal or prevent that goal from coming about? And ideally, we should be doing this for every species, regardless of its ultimate origin. We should be saying, what's our goal, and are you helping? Are you hindering, or are you neutral? And if you're helping or if you're neutral, I don't think we should be bothering to spend the cash or the resources to pull it out or get rid of it. Now, again, this is a pragmatism that I think has largely been embraced by you all. I'm sure that most of the removals that you're doing are for species that have really short-term and obvious harms to things that people care about, to goals that many people care about. But there is a philosophical, sort of psychological change that I'm advocating for here, which is that we don't look down our noses at these plants and animals that have joined us here in North America. Because after all, they don't know that they're non-native. They didn't come here to cause harm. Okay, so how, obviously there is other considerations besides just, does this plant or animal help or hinder the goal for my site? One of these considerations might be, what is the status of the species in its native range? This guy, the Chinese wattle-neck soft-shell turtle, is endangered in its native range in China, and it is non-native and sort of, has been described as invasive in Kauai, where it's hanging out in the streams there. So when you decide whether or not to try to remove it from the streams of Kauai, you also want to pay attention to whether or not doing that would actually threaten the long-term viability of the entire species. In the case of this guy, there's a widespread feeling that it's not going to be easy to conserve it in its native range, and it might be smarter to actually let it hang out in Kauai a little bit. So, which I can tell you more about this fascinating study if you want. They did this whole examination of what it eats, and it basically is eating all non-natives, because the freshwater systems in Hawaii are so dominated by non-natives that it's basically living in this whole novel ecosystem, which we'll talk about in a second. All right, so that's one thing. And then you also really have to think about the goals of adjacent sites for which you might be a profit field source. What I'm really hoping that somebody can invent would be the sort of biological force field, which we could put around all of our different kinds of land management. So if you are a national park with a mission to educate about the certain historical state of an ecosystem, you could put this force field around your park, and then the people outside could feel free to embrace more non-natives. But until that force field is developed, we're going to have to be very cautious about embracing non-natives when we're adjacent to places where they're really not welcome. And then you also, of course, have to think about the laws and policies that you have to obey. But you should also think about whether or not those laws and policies should be changed. If there are laws and policies for your land that you're working on that are sort of just knee-jerk anti-non-native, and you're spending a lot of time and money carrying those out, time or money that could be spent on something more proactive and positive, it might be worth revisiting those policies. So I want to stress that when I'm talking about sort of calling a truce and asking questions first and then shooting later, I'm mostly talking about guys that have already showed up, plants and animals that have already showed up and that you're trying to figure out how to deal with. I think that preventing new introductions is still a very good idea, because our knowledge of what they're going to do is so limited. We still don't really know what's going to flourish and what's not, and how they're going to interact. So I think it would be very prudent to try to continue vigorous efforts to try to stop new introductions. Of course, having said that, there's always an exception. What about assisted migration? What about animals that are at risk from climate change, animals that might not be able to persist in their native ranges as things heat up? There's a lot of interest in moving these species north or towards the poles or up mountains to places where they might be able to thrive in the future. And that means essentially creating a non-native introduction on purpose and potentially invasive, and we want them to flourish, you know, so depending on how you define invasive, we may be getting into the invasive species creation business. So that brings up this notion of novel ecosystems, and I think that at your next month's meeting, you're going to hear a different perspective on these. I love this concept, and I'll tell you why. So these are, novel ecosystems are ecosystems that are dominated by non-natives, but not just one non-native, not just a monoculture, but something more like the scene you see here in Hawaii. This is on the Big Island, where it's actually a really diverse system that includes some natives, but also includes lots of non-natives. There's probably species from every tropical continent, you know, every tropical place here, from Asia, from South America, from Australia, and of course from Hawaii, and they're all kind of cohabitating here. Joe Mascaro, who's now at Stanford, when he was a grad student, he did a lot of work studying these systems and finding that they are really very similar to native ecosystems as far as their basic functions of cycling nutrients and sequestering carbon and creating leaf litter and having lots of bugs living in them. They kind of work. So the question is, what do we do with these? Are they trash, or are they the planet Earth responding to all of these crazy anthropogenic changes and actually assembling something that is resilient? You know, you could go probably too far on either end of this, but I do think that they are better than a big parking lot or another suburban development. And my interest in promoting them as something worth studying and worth preserving is in keeping more open space open. And also learning from them, learning how, you know, what is going to be resilient and robust in this sort of future, new future that's going to be a lot different from the baseline conditions that we're often thinking about. Here's another novel ecosystem that I really like. This one is sort of hard to fault because it's the first colonizing plant on a new lava flow that flowed out in the early 60s. So you can't even really say these are invasive because they are all new. So you've got ohia, which is the guy with the red flowers there, and that's a native, and Asian sword fern and Australian ironwood. And those just happen to be the three dominant species that are colonizing this new site. So it'll be really interesting to see how this develops over time. And I think it would probably be expensive and kind of difficult, and maybe not even that smart to try to rip out all the sword fern and the ironwood. Maybe it would be doable, but it's very, you know, it's very difficult to control non-natives there. So species don't know where they are, and they don't care about nativeness, and that's sort of our baggage. And so I kind of think that maybe we should set that aside a little bit and start focusing on things like preventing extinctions. Obviously, we already focused on that, and ecosystem resilience in the face of change, and inculcating a love of nature. One of my favorite stories about resilience, sort of management for resilience, is here in the Seychelles, which is, they had a cinnamon forestry there. I don't know if it's still active, but for a while they had a lot of cinnamon forestry, and the cinnamon thrive there, and they're now everywhere. So these huge forests, and practically nothing but cinnamon. And the first impulse of ecologists there was to rip out the cinnamon because it's the non-native. But when they did, they found that, first of all, other non-natives would immediately spring up into the sunlit patches, you know, into the sort of as the sun started to hit the ground. And secondly, they found that a lot of the native birds are actually eating the cinnamon fruits from these trees. So if they rip out all the cinnamon, the bird, and before they've managed to establish any kind of native canopy, the birds are going to be in bad shape. So what they've decided to do is a kind of a collaboration with the forest. They are taking out 1 or 2 or 3 cinnamon trees and then planting like a little plug of native plants within the forest matrix. So they're not creating sunlit patches on the forest floor. They're only removing enough to keep their site shady and to be able to put in some natives. And I guess the idea with this is that over time they can slowly increase the percentage of natives, but they might never get it to be 100%. There might always be a mix of cinnamon forest and native forest here. And that might be okay. That might work out for the Seychelles. That might be something that is resilient in the future and that can support the birds and that people like. So the last thing I want to talk about is the sort of the next generation and how they're going to see this. I guess I worry that if we continue to be really negative about non-natives, we're going to hand our children a world that is really negative, that is dominated by trashy, bad, ugly places, because there's going to just be increasing movement of species. So here is, where I live now in Oregon, where I grew up in Seattle, the English ivy is one of the most despised non-natives, and here's the No Ivy League, which is run by the city of Portland. And I love this little quote. They say, you know, they've got this great program, or they're pretty excited about this program where they have volunteers and kids come out and pull ivy. And they say, though chemical and mechanical removal can be effective in the appropriate situation, No Ivy League uses hand removal techniques to provide the experience of stewardship to a wider audience. So basically, they could probably just nuke all this stuff with, I don't know, Roundup or something like that, but instead they're having people pull it because they feel like that is going to really bring them along and get them excited about stewardship. But this is like a really negative interaction to have with nature. If you are the kind of kid who stays inside and plays video games and then you get brought out into the nature and the first thing you do is start ripping it out, that doesn't seem to be, and told that it's ugly and bad, that doesn't seem to be like a very great way to build a relationship. I do agree that kids like to touch nature and not just have to walk through a national park with their hands in their pockets. I think that's, having kids of my own, I can tell you that looking at landscapes is much less interesting to them than fiddling with them. But I think doing things like going hunting or collecting natural specimens, or building forts, these kinds of interactions are probably going to inculcate a much more robust and positive sense of nature than ripping about a bunch of ivy. So, and actually when I was listening to your intro about the ash seed collection, that seemed to me like a really, from the first group that spoke, that seemed to me like a really great way to get people involved. So in that case, instead of going out and removing something bad, what you're going out is lovingly preserving something that's good. And I like that kind of framing better for a volunteer project. So I'll just leave you with this picture of this Brazilian pepper, which you probably know is kind of invasive or considered invasive in Florida. I was having dinner with Stuart Pym in Miami a couple years ago, and he said that when he sees this plant in Brazil, he thinks it is beautiful. But when he sees this plant in Florida, he thinks it is ugly. And I think that if we continue to think like that, we're going to live in an ugly world, and we're going to hand an ugly world off to our kids. So I think what we need to realize is that the Brazilian pepper does not care where it is, and it is just as beautiful in Florida. Now, we may want to hack it out of certain areas and poison its stumps, but that doesn't mean that it's ugly, and that a world where Brazilian pepper flourishes in Florida is an ugly world. That's it. Thanks so much.